The tray of glasses shook in Elena Rossi's hands the moment the black car stopped outside the trattoria, and she did not yet know why her whole body had gone cold. She only knew that every time that car appeared on the narrow street, the air in the restaurant changed, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She set the tray down carefully, wiped her palms on her apron, and told herself the same thing she told herself every week. He is just a customer. He always sits in the same booth. He always orders the same coffee. He will leave, and tomorrow will come, and nothing will be different. But something about tonight felt different before it had even begun. The door opened, and the small bell above it rang, a sound so ordinary that it almost made the moment feel safe. Don Vittorio Marchetti walked in, wearing a dark coat, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he owns everything inside it, including the people. Two men followed him, quiet and alert, taking their usual positions near the window. Vittorio did not sit right away. He paused near the counter, watching Elena stack cups with hands that betrayed her nerves. "Buonasera," he said, his voice smooth, almost lazy, the tone of a man who never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Good evening," Elena replied, keeping her tone light, professional, unremarkable. It was the tone she used for every customer, the tone that protected her. He tilted his head slightly, studying her, and something in his eyes sharpened, as if he had noticed a detail he liked. Then he spoke again, this time in fast, playful Italian, the kind spoken quickly on purpose, layered with an idiom that most foreigners would never catch, a phrase that gently mocked her simple uniform and her tired eyes, comparing her to a small bird, pretending to understand the language of eagles. He expected her to smile blankly, the way she always did, the way anyone without real fluency would, catching only the music of the words and none of their meaning. But this time, Elena did not smile blankly. She looked up, met his eyes without fear, and answered him in Italian so fluent, so precise, so effortlessly elegant, that for a moment the entire room seemed to stop moving. She corrected the tense he had used, pointed out that his idiom was slightly outdated, more common to his grandfather's generation than his own, and suggested, with a small, polite smile, that if he wanted to insult someone properly, he should at least use the current phrase for it. Silence. The two men near the window turned their heads. One of them actually reached for his glass and paused, frozen mid-motion. Nobody spoke to Vittorio Marchetti like that. Nobody corrected him. Nobody smiled while doing it. For 3 long seconds, his face showed nothing at all, and Elena's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. She had spent months keeping her head down, avoiding attention, protecting the quiet, invisible life she had built after everything fell apart. She had just broken every rule she had set for herself, and she did not know if he was about to be furious or something else entirely. Then Vittorio Marchetti laughed. It was not a polite laugh, not the kind men gave to be courteous. It came from somewhere real, sudden and unguarded, the kind of laugh that surprised even the person laughing. His men exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to relax or worry. "Where?" he asked, still smiling, switching back to English now. "Did a waitress in this small restaurant learn to speak Italian like a professor?" Elena felt her cheeks warm, unsure whether she had just made a terrible mistake or something else entirely. She picked the tray back up, steadying her hands. "I studied languages once," she said simply. "A long time ago." "Once," he repeated, as if tasting the word. "What happened?" "Life happened," she said, and turned to walk toward another table, leaving the question hanging in the air behind her, unanswered, deliberately so. Vittorio watched her go, an unfamiliar expression crossing his face, something between curiosity and quiet respect. He walked to his usual booth and sat down without being told, and for the rest of that evening, his eyes kept finding her across the room. Elena spent the rest of her shift moving carefully, refusing to let herself glance toward his table more than necessary, though she felt his attention like warmth on her skin. She had grown up learning to read rooms quickly, a skill sharpened by years of watching her family's fortunes rise and then collapse, and every instinct she had told her that a man like Vittorio Marchetti did not simply forget being outsmarted by a waitress. He would either dismiss it entirely, or he would come back. She hoped it was the first. She feared it was the second. By the time her shift ended, the restaurant had emptied except for the owner locking the register and Vittorio's booth, which sat abandoned, his coffee cup rinsed and turned neatly upside down the way he always left it. A strange, small habit of order in a man who commanded chaos. Elena untied her apron, gathered her coat, and stepped out into the cool evening air, grateful for the silence of the street after a night full of tension. She did not notice the black car parked quietly at the corner until she was halfway down the block. The window rolled down, slow and deliberate. "You walk home alone every night." Vittorio's voice came from inside, calm, almost concerned, though concern did not seem like a word that fit him easily. Elena stopped, startled, her pulse quickening again. "I do," she said carefully. "It is not far." "It is late," he said. "The streets are not always kind to people walking alone." "I have walked this street for 2 years," she said, keeping her voice steady, despite the way her hands had begun to tremble slightly at her sides. "I know it better than most people know their own homes." He studied her for a long moment through the open window, and something in his gaze shifted again, quieter this time, less playful, more thoughtful. "You correct my Italian, you refuse my concern, and you walk home in the dark without fear," he said. "Tell me, Elena, is there anything about me that frightens you?" She hesitated. It would have been easy to lie, to tell him what men like him wanted to hear, the kind of fear that flattered their power. But she had built her life on refusing easy lies, even when the truth cost her something. "Everything about you should frighten me," she said honestly, "and yet somehow tonight, it does not." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city hummed quietly around them, distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea what was happening on this particular street corner. "Good night, Don Marchetti," she said finally, and continued walking, refusing to look back, though every nerve in her body wanted to see his expression. Behind her, the car did not move for a long moment. Then, slowly, it pulled away in the opposite direction, leaving her alone with the strange, unfamiliar feeling that something important had just shifted, quietly and irreversibly, in a life she had worked so hard to keep small and unnoticed. The next morning, Elena woke in the small apartment she shared with her mother and younger brother, the walls thin enough that she could hear her mother's cough through them, a sound that had grown worse over the past few months, despite the medicine Elena worked overtime to afford. She lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the previous night's conversation, before she could stop herself. She had not meant to correct him. It had simply happened, an instinct born from years of study, a reflex she had buried under years of exhaustion and forced silence. She had trained herself so carefully to be invisible, to be the quiet, unremarkable waitress who brought coffee and cleared plates and disappeared into the background of other people's important lives. And in one careless moment, she had made herself impossible to forget. She rose, dressed quietly, and moved into the small kitchen to prepare tea for her mother, whose frail hands wrapped gratefully around the warm cup when Elena brought it to her. "You seem distracted," her mother said, studying her daughter's face with the quiet perceptiveness that illness had somehow sharpened rather than dulled. "Did something happen at the restaurant?" "Nothing important," Elena said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Her younger brother, Daniel, wandered into the kitchen still half asleep, reaching for the bread on the counter. At 16, he had grown quiet over the past year, old enough to understand how much their family had lost, too young to fully accept it. He glanced at Elena, sensing something unspoken in the air, but too tired to ask. "I have to get to work," Elena said, kissing her mother's forehead gently. "Rest today. I will bring dinner when I return." Walking to the restaurant that morning, Elena found herself glancing at every dark car she passed, half expecting to see him again, half hoping she would not. She told herself the encounter had been a strange, isolated moment, the kind of thing that happened once and then faded quietly into memory. She was wrong. Vittorio returned that same evening, earlier than his usual hour, sitting in his booth with none of the mocking playfulness from the night before. Instead, he watched her work with quiet, careful attention, and when she finally approached his table to take his order, he set down the small leather notebook he had been writing in. "Tell me something," he said, his voice lower now, more genuine. "The language, the vocabulary, the precision, that is not something one learns from books alone." "Where did you study?" Elena hesitated, weighing how much truth to offer a man whose interest could easily become dangerous. "Florence," she said finally. "I studied linguistics there, before circumstances changed." "What circumstances?" "The kind that change a family's fortune overnight," she said simply, refusing to elaborate further. Vittorio nodded slowly, as if recognizing something familiar in her guarded answer, some shared understanding of how quickly a life could be rewritten by forces outside one's control. "I understand more about sudden changes of fortune than you might imagine," he said quietly, and for the first time, Elena saw something almost human behind the careful, controlled expression he wore like armor. "Why do you come here every week?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. "This is a small restaurant. Surely a man like you could dine anywhere in the city." He considered the question seriously before answering. "Because for 1 hour, in this small room, nobody expects anything from me," he said. "No decisions, no consequences, no men waiting for orders. Just coffee, and silence, and a waitress who apparently knows more Italian grammar than most professors." Despite herself, Elena smiled. "I only correct what deserves correcting." "Then I hope to deserve correcting again soon," he said, and there was something in his tone, warm and unguarded, that told her this conversation, unlike the countless others she had shared with countless customers, would not be easily forgotten by either of them. Over the following days, their exchanges continued, brief conversations exchanged over coffee cups and cleared plates, each one revealing small, careful pieces of two very different lives, slowly, cautiously intersecting. Elena learned that Vittorio read poetry when he could not sleep, that he had once wanted to study architecture before his family's business claimed him instead, that beneath the composed exterior he presented to the world existed a man who felt trapped by obligations he had never chosen for himself. And Vittorio learned that Elena had once dreamed of becoming a translator, working between languages and cultures, before her father's failed investments left her family with nothing, forcing her to abandon university and take whatever work she could find to keep her mother's medicine paid for and her brother fed. Neither of them spoke of what this growing familiarity might mean, though both privately understood that something rare and unexpected had begun quietly taking root between them, something that neither the careful walls of her modest life nor the dangerous walls of his powerful one had been built to contain. The restaurant's owner, a kind but nervous man named Edward, began to notice the pattern too, watching with growing unease as Vittorio's visits grew longer and Elena's smiles, once professional and distant, became something warmer, more genuine. He said nothing directly, but Elena noticed the way his eyes followed Vittorio's car whenever it pulled away, the way his shoulders tightened whenever the two of them spoke for longer than a few polite sentences. "Be careful," Edward said to her one evening, after Vittorio had left and the restaurant had emptied for the night. "Men like him do not simply visit restaurants for coffee. Elena, whatever this is becoming, it will not stay simple." "I know," Elena said quietly, though she was not entirely certain she believed her own words. That night, walking home under a sky heavy with clouds, Elena found herself thinking not of the danger Edward had warned her about, but of the quiet, unexpected warmth she had glimpsed behind Vittorio's careful composure, the sense that somewhere beneath the reputation and the fear he inspired in others existed a man who felt as trapped by his circumstances as she felt by hers. She did not yet know how deeply their two worlds were about to collide, or how much both of them stood to lose in the process. She only knew that something had shifted the night she corrected his Italian, something neither of them could easily undo, and that whatever came next would test every careful boundary she had built to keep herself and her family safe. For now, she walked home alone, the cool night air on her face, unaware that in the shadows of the city, others had already begun to notice the growing bond between the feared Don Marchetti and the quiet waitress who dared to correct his every word. A few streets from the restaurant, a man named Gregory sat in a parked sedan, watching the trattoria's door with patient, practiced attention. He worked for a rival family, one that had spent years searching for any weakness in Vittorio Marchetti's carefully guarded life. For months, they had found nothing. No habits to exploit, no soft points to press. Until now, he lifted a small notebook of his own and wrote a single line before starting the engine and driving quietly away into the dark. Elena reached her apartment building a few minutes later, climbing the narrow stairs slowly, her legs tired from a long shift, but her mind still turning over every word Vittorio had spoken that evening. She let herself in quietly, careful not to wake her mother, and found Daniel still awake at the kitchen table, a school book open in front of him, though his eyes looked far away. "You are home late again," he said, not looking up. "The restaurant was busy," Elena replied, hanging her coat by the door. "It is always busy lately," Daniel said, finally meeting her eyes. Ever since that man started coming. Elena's chest tightened. She had not realized her brother had noticed anything at all. "What do you mean?" "I walked past last week to bring you your umbrella," he said. "I saw the black car. Everyone on the street stopped what they were doing when it arrived. Even the shopkeepers looked nervous." He studied her carefully. "Who is he, Elena?" She sat down across from him, choosing her words with care. "A customer," she said. "Nothing more." Daniel did not look convinced, but he let the subject drop, perhaps sensing that his sister needed rest more than she needed questions. Elena helped him finish a difficult passage in his textbook, grateful for the small, ordinary comfort of helping her brother with schoolwork, a task far removed from the strange, uncertain feelings stirring inside her. Later, lying in bed, she stared at the cracked ceiling above her and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine a version of her life where fear did not shape every decision, where a man's attention could simply be flattering rather than dangerous, where corrections in grammar could remain nothing more than corrections in grammar. But even as the thought formed, she knew better than to trust it completely. She had learned, painfully, that comfort often arrived just before loss, that the moments which felt safest were sometimes the most fragile of all. Still, sleep came slowly that night, carried on the memory of a laugh she had not expected to hear, and a pair of eyes that had looked at her not as a waitress to be dismissed, but as someone worth truly seeing. The phone rang at 3 in the morning, and Elena's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped it before answering. "Is this Elena Rossi?" a woman's voice asked, brisk and clinical. "Yes," Elena whispered, already sitting up, already sensing bad news, the way a body senses a storm before the first drop of rain falls. "Your mother has been brought to the hospital. You should come now." Elena moved through the next hour in a blur, waking Daniel, finding a coat, running down dark streets toward the hospital with her heart pounding louder than her footsteps. By the time she arrived, her mother lay pale and still in a narrow bed, an oxygen mask covering her face, a doctor speaking in careful, measured words about infection, about weakened lungs, about the cost of the stronger medicine that might actually help. The number the doctor mentioned was more than Elena earned in 2 months. She sat beside her mother's bed until morning light crept through the window, holding her thin hand, whispering promises she did not know how she would keep. Daniel sat silently in the corner, his young face pale with a fear he tried and failed to hide. By the time Elena arrived at the restaurant that evening, exhaustion had carved shadows beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she tied her apron. Edward noticed immediately. "You look terrible," he said, not unkindly. "Go home, Elena. Rest." "I need the hours," she said simply, and he did not argue further, though his eyes followed her with quiet concern for the rest of the evening. Vittorio arrived later than usual that night, and the moment he saw her, something in his expression changed, sharpening with immediate attention the careful composure he usually wore, replaced by something more direct. "What happened?" he asked, before she had even reached his table. "Nothing," she said automatically, the practiced lie rising before she could stop it. "Elena," his voice carried a quiet authority that made refusal difficult. "Tell me what happened." She hesitated, exhaustion wearing down the walls she had built so carefully. "My mother is in the hospital," she said finally, the words escaping before she could pull them back. "She needs medicine we cannot afford. It is not your concern. Everything happening to you has become my concern, he said quietly, and the simple honesty in his voice startled her more than any dramatic declaration could have. I did not tell you so you would fix it, she said, straightening her shoulders despite her exhaustion. I do not want your money, Don Marchetti. I did not offer money, he said. I offered concern. There is a difference, even if you refuse to see it tonight. She had no answer for that, and she returned to her work, leaving him watching her with an expression she could not fully read. The following morning, a Dr. Elena had never met, arrived at her mother's hospital room, introducing himself as a specialist in respiratory illness, explaining gently that he had been asked to review her mother's case personally. Elena stood frozen in the doorway, understanding immediately who had sent him, though nothing about the arrangement had been mentioned to her directly. She found Vittorio that evening before her shift began, waiting near his car outside the restaurant. You said you did not offer money, she said, her voice tight with a complicated mixture of gratitude and fierce protective pride. A specialist is not free, Don Marchetti. I offered a friend a favor, he said calmly. The specialist owed me something. Now the debt is settled. Your mother receives excellent care, and I have lost nothing in the exchange. You are lying, she said, though softer now. Perhaps, he admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly, but it is a kind lie, and I think you need one tonight. Elena felt something crack open inside her chest, a wall she had spent years reinforcing suddenly showing its first real weakness. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You do not know me, not truly. I know that you correct my grammar without fear, he said. I know you walk home alone at night, refusing my protection, out of pride rather than necessity. I know you carry your family's entire weight on shoulders, far too thin for such a burden, and still, you smile at strangers every single evening, as though the weight does not exist. He paused, studying her carefully. I think, Elena Rossi, that I know you better than you assume. She did not know how to respond to that, so she said nothing at all, standing silently beside him in the cool evening air, until her shift called her back inside. Over the following days, her mother's condition slowly improved, the new medicine working exactly as the specialist had promised, color returning gradually to her pale face, strength returning gradually to her weakened lungs. Elena visited every morning before her shift, sitting beside the hospital bed, grateful beyond words, yet troubled by a debt she could never fully repay. Vittorio's visits to the restaurant continued, though something between them had shifted, the playful teasing of their first encounter, replaced now by a quieter, more careful honesty. He told her about his father, a man who had built the family's power through fear rather than respect, who had taught his son early that weakness was a luxury men in their position could not afford. He told her about the funeral he had attended as a teenager, the first of many, and how he had learned to bury grief quickly, because grief, in his world, was often mistaken for vulnerability. Elena listened, offering few words but careful attention, understanding intuitively that Vittorio needed a witness more than he needed advice, someone who would hear his history without judgment or fear. In return, she told him about Florence, about the small apartment she had shared with 3 other students, about the professor who had first noticed her gift for languages and encouraged her to pursue translation work with international organizations. She told him about the night her father called to say the family's investments had collapsed entirely, and how she had returned home within a week, abandoning a future she had worked years to build. Do you regret it? Vittorio asked one evening, after she had finished the story. Leaving that life behind? Every single day, she admitted honestly. But regret does not pay for medicine, Don Marchetti. Some choices are not really choices at all. Call me Vittorio, he said quietly. When it is only us, at least, allow me that. She hesitated, aware of how much smaller that request made the distance between them feel, aware of how dangerous that smaller distance could become. But something in his voice, tired and genuine, made refusal impossible. Vittorio, she said softly, testing the name, and something in his expression softened at the sound of it, as though very few people ever spoke his name without fear attached to it. Neither of them noticed, that particular evening, a man sitting quietly at the far end of the restaurant, nursing a cup of coffee far longer than any ordinary customer would, his eyes moving carefully between them, memorizing details he would later report to men who had been waiting patiently for exactly this kind of information. The rival family had found their opening. Days passed, and the bond between Elena and Vittorio deepened in small, quiet ways, unnoticed by either of them, until it had already become impossible to undo. He began arriving earlier, staying later, finding reasons to extend conversations that could easily have ended after a few polite sentences. She began looking forward to his visits with an anticipation she tried, unsuccessfully, to convince herself was simply professional courtesy. One evening, after the restaurant had emptied, and Edward had already gone home, Vittorio lingered at his table long after his coffee had gone cold. "Walk with me," he said, standing and offering his arm with an old-fashioned formality that made Elena smile despite herself. "I should be closing up," she said, though she was already removing her apron. They walked together along the quiet street outside, the city lights reflecting softly on wet pavement from an earlier rain. For the first time since their conversations began, silence stretched comfortably between them, neither feeling the need to fill it with words. "I have not walked simply to walk, in longer than I can remember," Vittorio said eventually. "Every walk I take has purpose, destination, security concerns. Tonight, for the first time, I am simply walking." "How does it feel?" Elena asked. He considered the question seriously. "Terrifying," he admitted, and they both laughed, the sound echoing softly down the empty street. They reached the corner where their paths would normally separate, and Vittorio stopped, turning to face her directly. "Elena," he said, his voice quieter now, more serious. "I know what I am. I know the danger that follows a man like me, the danger that could follow anyone standing close enough to be seen beside me. I will not pretend otherwise, not to you, not after everything you have shown me about honesty." "Then why are we standing here?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because for the first time in longer than I can remember," he said, "I find myself unwilling to walk away, simply because staying is dangerous." Elena felt her heart pounding, torn between the fear Edward had warned her about and the quiet, undeniable pull she felt standing there in the cool night air. "My life is complicated enough without adding your world to it," she said honestly. "I know," he said, "and still, here I am." She did not have an answer for that, not yet, so she simply allowed the silence to stretch between them a moment longer, before finally saying goodnight and walking the rest of the way home alone, though for the first time, walking alone felt less like independence and more like an absence she had not expected to notice so keenly. What neither of them knew, as they parted that night beneath the quiet streetlights, was that the man who had watched them from the corner table had already made his report, and that the rival family's plans, long dormant for lack of opportunity, had finally found the exact weakness they had been searching for. Two of Vittorio's closest men, Marco and Luca, had worked beside him since childhood, long before the weight of the family's business had settled fully onto his shoulders. They noticed the change in him before anyone else did, the way his attention drifted during meetings, the way his usual sharp impatience softened whenever the conversation turned, even briefly, toward the small restaurant on the quiet street. "You are distracted," Marco said one afternoon, as the three of them reviewed reports in Vittorio's private office, a room lined with old books and heavy curtains that blocked out most of the daylight. "Since when does the waitress occupy this much of your thinking?" "Since she proved more interesting than every person in this room combined," Vittorio replied, only half joking, and Luca exchanged a worried glance with Marco that Vittorio pretended not to notice. "Our rivals are not blind," Luca said carefully. "If they notice this pattern before we address it, they will use it. You know this better than anyone." "I know," Vittorio said, his voice quieter now, the humor draining from it. "I am not foolish enough to ignore the risk. I simply find myself, for the first time in years, unwilling to let the risk decide everything for me." Marco studied his old friend carefully. They had grown up together, buried fathers together, learned the harsh rules of their world together, and in all that time, he had rarely seen Vittorio speak with such quiet vulnerability. "Does she know what she has stepped into?" he asked. Not fully, Vittorio admitted, and I intend to keep it that way as long as possible. But secrets in their world rarely stayed contained for long, and within days, whispers began circulating among rival families that the feared Don Marchetti had developed an unusual attachment to a waitress, with no name recognition, no family connections, no protection beyond the modest walls of a small restaurant. For men who had spent years searching for any crack in his careful defenses, the whispers arrived like a gift too valuable to ignore. Antonio Russo, head of a rival family that had long resented Marchetti's territory and influence, received the report with quiet satisfaction. He had spent years probing for weakness and finding none, watching Vittorio conduct his affairs with the discipline of a man who trusted almost nothing and no one. A waitress, however, was different. A waitress could be watched, approached, used as leverage, without the same risk that came from targeting someone already protected within their world. Find out everything about her, Antonio instructed his men, where she lives, who she loves, what she needs. Every person has a weakness, and hers will not be difficult to find. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her, Elena continued her ordinary days, splitting her time between the restaurant, the hospital where her mother's recovery progressed steadily, and the small apartment where Daniel had begun asking more pointed questions about the man whose car he saw parked outside their building more frequently than either of them acknowledged aloud. "He walked you home again," Daniel said one evening, not quite a question. "He did," Elena admitted, seeing no point in denying what her brother had clearly already witnessed with his own eyes. "Is this serious?" Daniel asked, his young face carrying a seriousness beyond his years, shaped by too many hardships too early in life. "I do not know," Elena said honestly. "I only know that talking with him feels different than anything I have experienced before, and I am trying to decide whether that difference is a gift or a warning." "Maybe it is both," Daniel said quietly, and Elena found herself surprised by the wisdom in her brother's simple observation. That evening, Vittorio arrived at the restaurant, carrying something unusual for him, a small, carefully wrapped book, rather than his usual leather notebook. He waited until the restaurant had mostly emptied before approaching Elena, who was wiping down the counter after a long shift. "For you," he said, placing the package gently on the counter. Elena unwrapped it carefully, finding a beautifully bound collection of Italian poetry, the kind of edition rare enough to suggest considerable expense, despite its unassuming, elegant cover. "Vittorio," she said softly, running her fingers over the worn leather. "This is too much." "It is a book," he said simply. "Nothing more. You mentioned once that you missed reading poetry in its original language. I remembered." "You remembered something I mentioned only once, weeks ago," she said, studying him carefully. "I remember everything you tell me," he said, his voice quiet and direct. "It is, perhaps, an unfortunate habit of mine when it comes to you specifically." Elena felt warmth spread through her chest, despite every instinct urging caution, every lesson life had taught her about the danger of trusting comfort too quickly. She opened the book carefully, finding a particular poem already marked with a thin ribbon, a piece about the quiet, unexpected courage required simply to remain open to love, after loss had taught a heart to close itself protectively against further pain. "You chose this poem specifically," she said, understanding immediately. "I did," he admitted. "It reminded me of you, of us perhaps, though I recognize the arrogance in assuming there is an us to speak of at all." Elena closed the book gently, meeting his eyes directly. "There might be," she said softly, surprising herself with the honesty of the admission. "I am still deciding how frightened I should be of that possibility." "A wise position," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting into something between amusement and relief. "I confess I have been deciding the same thing myself, with considerably less success at reaching any useful conclusion." They talked long after the restaurant should have closed, Edward having long since gone home, trusting Elena to lock up properly. Their conversation drifted easily between lighter subjects and deeper ones, poetry and childhood memories, favorite foods and half-forgotten dreams, each exchange peeling back another careful layer of the walls both of them had built over years of disappointment and loss. It was during this conversation that Elena finally asked the question she had avoided for weeks. "What happens," she said carefully, "if I allow myself to care for you the way I suspect I already do, and your world eventually reaches into mine in ways neither of us can control?" Vittorio's expression grew serious, the playful warmth from moments before giving way to something heavier, more honest. "I would do everything within my power to prevent that," he said. "But I will not lie to you, Elena. Not now. Not after everything you have given me by simply being honest with me from the very beginning. My world carries danger that follows me everywhere, danger I cannot always predict or control, no matter how carefully I try. Then perhaps caring for you is not wise," she said quietly, though her voice lacked real conviction. "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I have found, in recent weeks, that wisdom and desire do not always walk the same path, and I am no longer entirely certain which one I am willing to follow when it comes to you." Elena said nothing for a long moment, staring down at the beautiful book in her hands, feeling the weight of an impossible decision settling slowly onto her shoulders. Finally, she looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet determination. "Then let us walk carefully," she said. "Together, if that is truly what we both want. But carefully, Vittorio. I have already lost too much to lose carelessly again." "Carefully," he agreed, reaching across the counter to take her hand gently in his, a small gesture that carried more weight than either of them fully expressed aloud. Neither of them noticed, through the restaurant's front window, a car parked quietly across the street, its driver watching the small, tender scene unfold with careful, calculating attention, already composing the report that would soon reach Antonio Russo's desk, a report that would set in motion consequences neither Elena nor Vittorio could yet imagine. Over the following week, their relationship deepened further, moving carefully from unspoken understanding into something neither of them bothered denying any longer. Vittorio introduced her, briefly and cautiously, to Marco and Luca, both of whom greeted her with careful, guarded politeness that gradually warmed as they witnessed the genuine change in their old friend's demeanor. "You have made him lighter," Marco told Elena quietly, one evening while Vittorio spoke with Luca across the room. "I have known him since we were boys, and I do not think I have seen him this unguarded in many years." "I worry that lightness makes him vulnerable," Elena admitted honestly. "Perhaps," Marco said, "but I have also learned that a man who forgets how to feel anything at all eventually becomes dangerous in different, quieter ways. Whatever risk you bring with you, I believe it is a risk worth taking, if only because the alternative was watching him slowly disappear into the coldness his position demands." Elena appreciated the honesty, though it did little to ease the quiet unease that had begun settling into her thoughts, a growing sense that something in the shadows around them had shifted, that eyes she could not see were watching more closely than before. She dismissed the feeling as exhaustion, as the natural anxiety of a woman unaccustomed to being loved by someone whose world moved according to rules she barely understood. She did not yet know how right her instincts truly were, or how quickly the fragile happiness she had allowed herself to feel was about to be tested by forces neither she nor Vittorio could fully control. The letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the restaurant's front door before opening hours, addressed simply to Elena in handwriting she did not recognize. She found it while sweeping the entrance, and something about its plain, unmarked envelope made her stomach tighten even before she opened it. Inside, a single typed sentence, cold and precise. "Leave him now, or watch everything you love disappear one piece at a time." Elena stood frozen in the empty restaurant, the broom slipping from her fingers, her mind racing through every person who might have sent such a message, and finding no clear answer, only a growing, suffocating dread. She thought immediately of her mother, still recovering, still fragile. She thought of Daniel, walking to school every morning through streets that suddenly felt far less safe than they had the day before. She did not tell Vittorio right away. Instead, she spent the day moving carefully through her shift, forcing calm into her voice whenever customers spoke to her, though her hands trembled slightly every time the restaurant door opened. When Vittorio arrived that evening, he noticed immediately that something had changed. "You are pale," he said, studying her closely. "What happened?" She hesitated only a moment before retrieving the letter from her apron pocket and handing it to him without a word. He read it once, his expression darkening into something cold and controlled, a version of him Elena had never witnessed before, one that reminded her sharply of exactly who he truly was, beneath the gentle warmth he had shown her these past weeks. "Who else knows about us?" he asked quietly, his voice tightly measured. "I do not know," Elena said. "I have told no one beyond my brother, and even then, I said very little." Vittorio folded the letter carefully, his jaw tight. "This did not come from idle curiosity," he said. "Someone has been watching us for some time. Someone who understands exactly what threatening your family would accomplish." "Who would do this?" Elena asked, fear creeping steadily into her voice despite her efforts to remain calm. "I have enemies who have waited years for exactly this kind of opportunity," Vittorio said grimly. "I did not want to bring that danger anywhere near you, Elena. This is precisely what I feared." That night, Vittorio arranged for quiet, careful protection to watch over Elena's apartment building without alarming her mother or brother, men positioned discreetly enough that neither Elena nor her family would notice their presence unless something went wrong. He also began quietly investigating which of his rivals might have grown bold enough to send such a direct threat, focusing his attention first on Antonio Russo, whose ambitions toward Vittorio's territory had simmered unresolved for years. Marco and Luca worked alongside him through the following days, tracing quiet threads of information, questioning contacts carefully, piecing together fragments that slowly began pointing toward Russo's involvement, though nothing yet offered definitive proof. Meanwhile, Elena found herself living with a constant, low hum of fear beneath every ordinary moment of her day. She watched strangers on the street with new suspicion, flinched at unexpected sounds, checked repeatedly on her mother and brother despite knowing, logically, that nothing had yet happened to either of them. The weight of it exhausted her, far more than any physical labor at the restaurant ever had. "Perhaps I should end this," she said to Vittorio one evening, sitting across from him in his private office, a room she had visited only twice before, each time feeling keenly aware of how far she had traveled from the safe, ordinary boundaries of her old life. "Perhaps distancing myself from you would remove the danger from my family entirely." "It would not," Vittorio said honestly, his voice heavy with something close to guilt. "Whoever sent that letter already knows about us. To distance now would not undo what they already know, and it would only confirm that threats against you succeed, inviting further attempts in the future, against you or against others I care for." "Then what do we do?" Elena asked, her voice tight with frustration and fear. "We find them before they find another opportunity," Vittorio said, "and we ensure, absolutely, that touching you or your family carries consequences severe enough that no one considers attempting it again." Elena studied him carefully, seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of the world he inhabited, a world where safety was purchased through strength and reputation rather than kindness or fairness. It frightened her, and yet she found herself unable to fully separate that fear from the fierce, protective determination in his eyes whenever he spoke of keeping her and her family safe. Days passed with careful investigation, slowly yielding results. Luca discovered that one of Antonio Russo's men had been seen repeatedly near the restaurant in recent weeks, always at a careful distance, always positioned to observe without being noticed. Marco confirmed the man's identity through contacts within Russo's organization, quietly loyal individuals who had grown weary of Russo's increasingly reckless ambitions. "It is Russo," Vittorio confirmed to Elena one evening, his expression grim but resolved. "He has wanted my territory for years and lacked the leverage to challenge me directly. He believes you represent exactly that leverage. What will you do?" Elena asked, dread tightening in her chest. "I will meet with him," Vittorio said, directly and without hesitation. "He needs to understand, clearly and permanently, that threatening you accomplishes nothing beyond guaranteeing his own downfall." "That sounds dangerous," Elena said carefully. "Everything in my world is dangerous," Vittorio replied, "but allowing this threat to continue unanswered is far more dangerous than confronting it directly." Elena wanted desperately to argue against the plan, to find some safer alternative that did not involve Vittorio walking directly into confrontation with a man ruthless enough to threaten her family from the shadows. But she understood, watching the quiet determination in his expression, that this was not a decision he would allow her to overturn, not when her safety hung in the balance. The night before the planned meeting, Vittorio came to her apartment for the first time, standing quietly in the small, modest living room that could not have looked more different from the private office where they usually spoke. He seemed almost out of place among the worn furniture and faded curtains, and yet something in his posture suggested a quiet, genuine comfort in simply being near her, regardless of the surroundings. "If something happens tomorrow," he began carefully. "Do not," Elena interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "Do not speak as though tomorrow might take you from me. I have lost enough people already, Vittorio. I refuse to prepare myself for losing you as well." He studied her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded crossing his features. "I did not expect," he said quietly, "that anyone would ever care this deeply whether I returned safely from anything. My world does not typically inspire that kind of concern." "Your world may not," Elena said, stepping closer to him, "but I am not entirely part of your world, Vittorio. I am simply someone who has come to care for you deeply, foolishly perhaps, but deeply nonetheless. Come back to me tomorrow, that is all I ask." He reached for her hand, holding it gently, his usual composure momentarily replaced by something far more vulnerable. "I will return," he promised quietly. "Whatever it takes, Elena, I will return." The following morning arrived heavy with tension, the kind that settled into every quiet corner of the apartment, into every forced smile Elena offered her mother and brother as she prepared for a shift she barely remembered afterward, her mind entirely consumed by thoughts of the meeting taking place across the city, a meeting whose outcome would shape far more than simply her own fragile happiness. She would not learn the full details of what occurred between Vittorio and Antonio Russo until later that evening, when Marco arrived at the restaurant instead of Vittorio, his expression carefully neutral, in a way that immediately filled Elena with dread. "Where is he?" She asked immediately, her voice trembling. "Is he safe?" "He is safe," Marco assured her quickly, seeing the fear in her eyes. "The meeting concluded successfully. Russo has agreed to withdraw his threats entirely, understanding clearly now the consequences of pursuing this path further." Relief flooded through Elena so intensely that her knees weakened slightly, and she gripped the counter for support. "Then why is he not here himself?" she asked. "He wished to see this resolved fully before returning to you," Marco said gently. "He wanted to ensure, personally, that every trace of danger toward your family had been properly addressed before allowing himself to celebrate the outcome with you." Elena felt tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, the release of days of accumulated fear finally finding an outlet. "Thank you, Marco," she said quietly, "for telling me, for understanding why I needed to know immediately." "He cares for you deeply," Marco said simply. "I have known him many years, and I have never witnessed him fight this hard to protect anyone beyond his immediate family. Whatever this is between you, Elena, I believe it is worth protecting." That evening, Vittorio finally arrived at the restaurant, looking tired but unharmed, and the moment Elena saw him standing in the doorway, she abandoned every careful boundary of professionalism she had maintained for months, crossing the room quickly to embrace him without hesitation, uncaring who witnessed the gesture. "You came back," she whispered against his shoulder. "I promised I would," he said quietly, holding her carefully, as though she were something rare and precious he had feared losing entirely. "Russo understands now, clearly and permanently, that threatening you was a mistake he will not repeat." "And you," Elena said, pulling back slightly to study his face carefully, "are you truly unharmed?" "Truly," he confirmed. The matter was resolved through words, not force. Russo understood quickly that the cost of continuing his threats would far outweigh any benefit he hoped to gain. Elena allowed herself, finally, to breathe fully, for the first time in days, the fear that had gripped her chest slowly loosening its hold. But even as relief washed over her, a quiet, persistent thought remained lodged in the back of her mind, a recognition that the danger surrounding Vittorio's world would likely never fully disappear, that today's resolution offered temporary peace rather than permanent safety. She pushed the thought aside for now, choosing instead to hold on to this moment of relief, standing quietly in the restaurant with the man she had come to love, despite every reasonable warning against doing so, uncertain what challenges still lay ahead, but grateful, deeply grateful, for this fragile, hard-won peace. Weeks passed, and the quiet peace they had earned slowly settled into something steadier, something that resembled, for the first time in either of their lives, an ordinary kind of happiness. Elena's mother continued recovering, her strength returning gradually until she could sit in the small kitchen each morning, without the oxygen tank beside her, sipping tea and watching her daughter with quiet, growing curiosity about the man who had apparently become a regular presence in Elena's life. "You have not brought him here," her mother observed one morning, studying Elena carefully over her teacup. "I did not want to overwhelm you," Elena admitted, "or worry you, given everything that happened." "I am stronger than you think," her mother said, a small, knowing smile crossing her face. "And I would very much like to meet the man who has put that particular light back in my daughter's eyes." Elena laughed softly, surprised by how much lighter she felt simply discussing the possibility openly, rather than hiding it carefully as she had for so long. "I will ask him," she said, "if you are certain." "I am certain," her mother replied. "Daniel has already told me everything he knows, which admittedly is not much, but enough to make an old woman curious." That evening, Elena mentioned the invitation to Vittorio, watching carefully for his reaction, uncertain how a man accustomed to boardrooms and careful negotiations might respond to something as ordinary and vulnerable as a family dinner in a modest apartment. "I would be honored," he said simply, and something in the quiet sincerity of his answer eased whatever remaining doubt Elena had carried about introducing these two separate halves of her life to one another. The dinner, when it finally happened, unfolded far more gently than Elena had anticipated. Vittorio arrived without his usual entourage, dressed simply, carrying a modest bouquet of flowers for her mother, and a small gift for Daniel, a book about architecture that reflected, quietly, the dream Vittorio himself had once abandoned. Daniel accepted it, with wide-eyed enthusiasm, quickly drawn into conversation about historic buildings and design, while Elena's mother watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "You are not what I expected," her mother said to Vittorio later, once Daniel had wandered off to examine his new book more closely. "What did you expect?" Vittorio asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. "Someone colder, perhaps," she admitted honestly. "Elena has told me little about your work, only enough to understand that it carries weight and danger. I expected someone who wore that weight visibly. Instead, I see a man who brought flowers, and remembered my son's interest in buildings, information Elena likely mentioned only once, in passing. Elena has taught me the value of remembering small details," Vittorio said, glancing toward her with quiet warmth. "Before her, I confess I paid little attention to such things." The evening continued warmly, filled with easy conversation and quiet laughter, and by the time Vittorio finally departed, Elena's mother pulled her aside with a knowing look. "That man loves you," she said simply, "truly and deeply, in a way that does not announce itself loudly, but reveals itself in small, careful gestures. Do not let fear convince you to walk away from something so rare, Elena." "I am trying not to," Elena admitted. "But his world still frightens me, even now." "Every life carries risk," her mother said gently. "The question is never whether risk exists, but whether the person beside you makes that risk worth carrying. I believe, watching him tonight, that he does." Elena carried her mother's words with her over the following weeks, allowing herself, slowly and carefully, to imagine a future she had not dared imagine before, one where her modest, careful life and Vittorio's complicated, powerful world might somehow find a way to coexist peacefully. That imagined future faced its true test one final time, when Vittorio arrived at the restaurant one evening, carrying an expression Elena had learned to recognize as serious, deliberate consideration. "I have been thinking," he said, once the restaurant had emptied, and they sat together at his usual booth, "about the life I want moving forward, and about the life I hope you might choose to build alongside me, if you are willing." Elena's heart quickened. "What are you saying, Vittorio?" "I am saying," he continued carefully, "that I have spent years believing my world required constant vigilance, constant strength, constant distance from anything soft enough to be used against me. You have shown me, patiently and honestly, that this belief was not entirely true. I want to build something different now, something steadier, something that allows both of us to exist safely alongside one another, without either of us sacrificing who we truly are. That sounds complicated, Elena said softly, though hope had already begun rising in her chest, despite her attempt at caution. It will be, Vittorio admitted. I do not offer you a simple life, Elena. I never could. But I offer you an honest one, built on the same honesty you showed me the very first night you corrected my careless Italian, instead of simply smiling politely and looking away. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, the weight of months of fear and hope finally converging into a single, clear moment of decision. I have spent my whole life protecting myself and my family from unnecessary risk, she said quietly. But I have learned, through you, that some risks are worth taking, if the reward waiting on the other side is genuine and real. Is this reward genuine and real to you? Vittorio asked, his voice carrying a rare vulnerability. You are, Elena said simply. Whatever complications your world brings, you yourself have become something real and steady in my life, something I no longer wish to protect myself from. Vittorio reached across the table, taking her hand gently in his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, allowing the quiet warmth of the restaurant to settle comfortably around them, undisturbed by fear or danger, or the careful distance either of them had once believed necessary to survive. In the months that followed, their relationship continued growing steadily, built not on the reckless intensity of their first encounters, but on the quiet, careful foundation of honesty and mutual respect they had established through every difficult challenge they had faced together. Vittorio gradually restructured certain aspects of his business, working carefully with Marco and Luca to reduce unnecessary risks, understanding that protecting Elena and her family required not just strength but genuine, sustained effort toward stability rather than constant conflict. Elena, meanwhile, found herself slowly returning to the studies she had once abandoned, encouraged by Vittorio to pursue translation work again, part-time at first, alongside her continuing shifts at the restaurant, until gradually, her old dream began resembling something achievable rather than simply a distant memory of a different life. Her mother continued recovering steadily, eventually strong enough to return to modest work of her own, grateful every single day for the specialist's care that had restored her health so thoroughly. Daniel, inspired by his gift from Vittorio, began seriously considering architecture as a future path, spending hours sketching buildings in notebooks that gradually filled an entire shelf in their small apartment. Antonio Russo, having learned the painful lesson of underestimating both Vittorio's resolve and Elena's quiet strength, retreated fully from any further attempts at conflict, choosing instead to focus his ambitions elsewhere, understanding clearly now the cost of testing boundaries that Vittorio would defend without hesitation. One evening, nearly a year after Vittorio had first mocked her in careless Italian, expecting a simple waitress incapable of understanding his words, Elena stood once again behind the same counter, wiping down the same worn surfaces, though everything about her life had changed dramatically since that first, unexpected encounter. Vittorio arrived, as he always did, sitting in the same booth, ordering the same coffee, though now he arrived not as a feared stranger testing her boundaries, but as a partner who had earned, slowly and carefully, a permanent place in her life. "Buonasera," he said, smiling as he settled into his seat. "Buonasera," Elena replied, smiling back, no longer needing to correct him, because somewhere along the way, without either of them fully noticing the transition, he had learned to speak the language of gentleness and respect as fluently as she had once corrected his careless grammar. Their story, unlike so many others shaped by fear and power, had found its way instead toward something steadier, something built patiently through honesty, rather than intimidation, proving that even in a world defined by danger and reputation, genuine connection could still take root and grow, provided both people were brave enough to nurture it carefully, one honest word at a time. And as the restaurant's small bell rang softly with each departing customer that evening, Elena found herself smiling quietly to herself, grateful beyond measure for the strange, unexpected path that had led her from a frightened waitress correcting a dangerous man's grammar to a woman who had found, against every reasonable expectation, a genuine and lasting love, worth every risk she had taken to protect it.